Hi, I'm Chris. I study the state and economic systems and how the world works. I've got lots of ideas on how to fix things. But even if you don't study those things, you probably have some ideas too. You could probably think of ways of making voting more representative or the distribution of wealth fairer. Every day I hear someone put forward an idea for the government to do that they think would make things better, and it probably would. If only it could become law. Today we're going to talk about why things don't usually get better, but also how they could. My thesis might sound counterintuitive, but if you want reform, agitate for revolution. And if you want revolution, work toward reform. As long as I've studied politics, I've been told there are two sources of change in politics: elections and reforms. People have been putting their faith in elections and reforms to make things better for hundreds of years. Why have we made so little progress? Why don't we regularly read news articles declaring poverty eradicated, at least within some jurisdiction, because that's what the people wanted? Or that we're making meaningful progress slowing down climate change? Why do social programs keep seeing their funding cut when people need more money to live every year? Why do rich people rarely face any justice for the crimes they commit? It's not that there are no changes in politics. There are. And good things can happen in politics. They're just rare, not the norm. The likes of Zoran Mamdani and Shama Sawant can make some positive changes, but there's only so much they can do within the confines of this system, which we're going to talk about. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like most changes in politics, the economy, healthcare, journalism, and schools are for the worse. Reforms that lead to freedom, justice, peace, safety, community, food, shelter, health, and education are few and far between, and usually only come thanks to major public outcry or massive campaigns. Why is it we can all think of reforms, and hardly any that would benefit us ever get passed? Why do we need to beg the state for things like food, homes, clean water, basic freedoms, or to punish rich people and police who break the law? Why doesn't it just do those things? It says on paper it does things. In fact, it guarantees things. They promised.
We had a deal, Kerr.
Just get out of here!
You signed an agreement, Kerr.
I don't care if I signed an agreement!
That's their side of the so-called social contract. I've been told all my life I live under a democracy, which means the state is just the servant of the people, and it's supposed to do what we want it to. Does it just not know people are poor and hungry and homeless and powerless? It's not that there can be no reforms that benefit most people. It's that the system we think works for us has a million ways to prevent change. It's not neutral. The state is a set of institutions that establish and enforce a social hierarchy, like a concrete ladder. I don't know, I'm just throwing out similes to see what works. If the ruling class, or even just a few of its members, disagree with your proposed reforms, it's almost impossible to turn them into law. They'll work to undermine any political candidate that proposes it. They'll persuade lawmakers to vote against it. They can use the media they own to manipulate enough of the public into opposing it. So we're subordinate to this system and the people who own it. Like an ottoman that they put their feet on. All right, I'll stop. When we petition the state, we're reinforcing the social hierarchy and our place at the bottom of it. Anything we ask for, however fair and merited, can be denied. And anything the system grants can be taken away. I've talked a lot before about how rights aren't really rights because the state doesn't have to enforce them. Rights reveal what the state really is. It writes down all kinds of promises, but in practice it only enforces rights and laws when it wants, how it wants. Reforms are dangled in front of us our whole lives as evidence of democracy and reason to keep working through the system. A political party says, vote for us and we'll implement this policy that would be popular, and then they don't do it. But they promise they will next election, and because our memories are so poor, we forget they break their promises. Well, unless they're promising more violence against more vulnerable people, because the state's already organized for that. Punishing and stealing from the most vulnerable in society is fundamental to the state, so you can't reform it away. So we wait. Sometimes people who were angry cool down enough that the issue loses immediacy, even though the underlying conditions haven't got any better. But sometimes the news stops talking about an issue and people forget. Like we forgot COVID was still around because the news suddenly stopped reporting on it. But even if the media address the issue, they have a way of reinforcing our faith in the system to make things better, and making us wait a little longer. The CBC, for example, tends to end its reports on politics with something like, "But he's hopeful the new government will deliver on its platform and do what's best for all Canadians." Chris Velapuerca, CBC News. I don't consider that journalism. That's inducing complacency. It's political ASMR, lulling you to sleep. I hope you enjoyed hearing me walk in pudding. Now I'm going to soothe your worries about the state of the world. Don't try to change things yourself. That might be illegal or hard. Wait for authority to do what it promised to. It's not like people are dying. Progress is inevitable. Telling people to wait until the time is right is a long-standing tradition in politics, right up there with saying you're not like other politicians. For those who aren't bought off by promises and want to do something while they wait, there are other legal paths to rejection they are permitted to explore. They can call or write to their congresspeople or MPs. That tells them their voters are mad. Every day on Blue Sky, people say, you have to let your congressperson know that you don't approve of specific policies or nominations. Sometimes they have petitions with lots of signatures, which is kind of the same thing as lots of people calling. I don't want to say petitioning politicians is of no value, because you can sometimes force their hand. But it depends on the decision. They don't have to listen to you. People higher up the hierarchy make the decisions for us. A monopoly on making the big decisions is fundamental to the state, so you can't reform it away. The politician decides what to do based on their incentives. Most laws and policies are written for the benefit of the richest people in their corporations, or upper middle class people in their interest groups. A politician doesn't want to go against their biggest donors or even potential donors. No matter how many votes you threaten to withhold, elections tend to go to the side that spent the most money, with the notable exceptions of both of Donald Trump's election wins. But maybe there are other ways to get reforms passed. There are lots of groups out there proposing and lobbying for specific reforms. You'll have heard of some of them. Repealing the Citizens United versus FEC decision would make the system more democratic, and that's why it's not going to happen. The decision lifted all limits on how much corporations and unions could donate to political parties. The people who own the corporations want to retain the power to buy elections and parties and judges in the marketplace of ideas. On the off chance we get this decision reversed before the world is a smoking ball of ruin, the wealthy will just remount a campaign for a new law or new judges or whatever it takes. The state works for corporations every day. Legislative wins for the people are easily reversed. Look at the New Deal. Over the decades, most of FDR's reforms have been dismantled, and now millions of people might as well be living through a Great Depression themselves. As of writing this script, Republicans are even withholding the meager few bucks people receive for SNAP benefits. You know, to eat? Shit, they're making fun of them. They're making fun of the people they've impoverished, the sick fucks. I guess surviving is a privilege, not a right. They're still taking your money, but now they're using it to build concentration camps for brown people and homeless people. Electoral reform is popular because it's easy to design a more representative system than the one you live under. I bet you can think of lots of ways to make politics more representative, like more representatives representing smaller districts so they have to get to know their constituents, or proportional representation to replace first past the post. Couldn't there be a law against lobbying? Or at least more restrictions on how much lobbies can lobby? People propose this kind of thing every day, and every day the state says no. Every type of electoral system has some group putting it forward. They could implement their ideas if they got elected, which they could be if their system were implemented, but it won't be, so they won't be. That's how you get people to hope, and how that hope keeps them banging their heads against the wall trying to knock it down. We've got the theoretical possibility that things could change, but the extremely low chance they will in practice. Calls to reform the police, too, have many pressure groups behind them. Sometimes they have to protest just to make cops follow the law, say by arresting other cops, and instead of getting results, they get tear gassed. It happened over and over in the protests for Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The state can pretend to grant concessions, like when it made cops start wearing cameras they could turn off that do about as much to stop police violence as, well, this poster. They banned chokeholds, but police still managed to kill more suspects than ever. Shooting people and getting away with it is one of the perks of the job. But our aim should be to reduce police violence, not just punish more people. Derica Purnell writes, "Punishment is not justice." When convictions do lead to cops entering prison, some people are excited because prisons are where we send poor, black, and disabled people to suffer. This justice is built upon maintaining this suffering for everyone else. I said I had ideas. Here are some reforms that might really solve problems. How about no more starting wars, ever? How about no more mass surveillance by corporations or the state? No more state secrecy and lying? ¿Qué tal no more corporations? How about just no more intellectual property? Or restricting planned obsolescence? How about granting people the freedom to opt out of the rule of the state? But that's silly. They're fatuous proposals. Only small states like Iceland or maybe some municipalities could ever implement such policies. Those functions, war, prison, police, surveillance, making you use money and then taking it from you, are integral to the state. So you can't reform them away. Any reform that would make the system truly democratic is unrealistic. That's why people's proposals for reform tend to be so mild. They know if they ask for anything worth having, like guaranteed food, homes, and electricity for everyone paid for by taxing the upper 1%, they'll get rejected. Like, sure, as many people suggest nowadays, we could theoretically tax billionaires out of existence. But how would you implement this tax when the system you're trying to reform is owned by billionaires? And yes, we should protect the environment from corporations owning and destroying it. Everyone wants it, but the state protects corporations from us. People are dying from lack of democracy. They don't have access to food, housing, and healthcare because the system takes their access to it away. Everything we want and need is behind walls protected by the state. The state is the biggest part of the problem. I think we should abolish it. I know it sounds outlandish at first, but the state, all states, all concentrations of power over others, all unnecessary social hierarchy crushes the chance to create a free, inclusive, equal, sustainable society. What's the alternative to abolition? To keep struggling against power forever while holding out for the state to fulfill its promises? Even if we can make whatever small changes here and there, why are we resigned to living under such conditions forever? Social hierarchy is unnecessary and harmful, not just to people's lives and freedoms, but to nature too. The state enforces and justifies social hierarchy. It takes our freedom and turns it into power. It needs to die. But abolition is a long-term goal, not something we're about to achieve today. Remember what I said at the beginning? If you want reform, you might want to push for revolution. And if you want revolution, a possible first step is reform. Let's start with the first point. If you just want reform, you might have to use militant strategies to get it. I know when people hear about militancy and revolution, they think I'm saying we should engage in open warfare against the state. But until we're part of a bigger movement, it might be fruitless or counterproductive, and it might destroy your life. Maybe start smaller. First, you might need to find others with similar interests. If you aren't sure what your goals are yet, you can figure them out together. I've often recommended reading the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or at least parts of it, in groups and putting it into practice. It's about working together to identify the sources of your problems and do something about them. For examples of what to do, let's go back to Derica Purnell and reining in the police. Organizers and people who care about justice must reject calls for peace and task forces, and the other ways that people in power waste our time and energy until they announce some future reform that won't get us free, like more body cameras or community relations boards. Instead, activists can call for cops to be fired and never allowed to work in public or private law enforcement. We need an expansion of cop watch programs as police departments shrink. There must be radical and beautiful trauma and healing responses for those neighborhoods and families who experience the killing. People organizing in that community should come up with a range of responses to all violence, which are more than prison or nothing. Most importantly, we need democratic, multiracial movements against the carceral state, but more broadly, against a society that uses police and prisons to manage black rebellion, oppressed people, and social inequality. In educating and organizing, we learn to stop appealing to people higher up than us. We learn to relate to each other as equals. We build a movement for the freedom of everyone. There's so much more to all this that I dip into in another video on my other channel. Ideally, we would weaken the power of the state over time without having to fire a shot. Defunding and abolishing police and prisons is still possible in some localities. Obviously, we need some kind of crisis response alternative, and it's possible such a thing already exists where you are. You could get involved, or you could start something new. You could learn about nonviolent conflict resolution and transformative justice and practice them in your community. If we have these things, we can prove to others they're possible and preferable, and we don't have to wait until the state or the revolution fixes everything. All this might not fit the popular image of revolution, but that's because the event of overthrow comes at the culmination of a long period of organizing. But depending what you're doing, it might be necessary to confront the state head-on. To go back to FDR and the New Deal reforms, let's remember where they came from. They weren't just good ideas government and business generously showered on people. Workers and activists fought police and Pinkertons, sometimes to the death, to make things better. When FDR was elected, he implemented a host of reforms. Progress was made when the ruling class allowed some changes to stave off revolution. Reform was the compromise. If you want revolution, great. How do we get to the point where we have a powerful movement? Radicalize everyone? Possibly by sharing my videos with them? As much as I appreciate and need every like, share, comment, and subscribe, this channel's not going to usher in a new age of liberation on its own. We need to act. We need wins. Reforms can be those wins. We can join organizations pushing for reforms and radicalize them. There's a lot behind this logic, so I'm going to quote at length an article from the Anarchist Library. A link to the full piece is in the description. People misunderstand what reformism actually is, to the point where they fail to see that reforms, or more accurately the process of fighting for reforms, are a necessary step towards social revolution. Reforms are vitally important for a whole host of reasons. One is just to help people in need survive and have a better life in the present. Both the Black Panther Party and Zapatistas adhered to this idea and advanced survival programs. While many believe this is actually an indictment of reforms because it takes the edge off revolutionary anger, not only is this a callous and classist argument, often coming from middle-class radicals who do not have to experience this deprivation, but it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the causes of revolution. Revolutions do not spring from despair or deep deprivation. They actually occur when expectations are rising, there's a belief in a better world, and this belief chafes against the reality of government as a hindrance. Another necessity if revolution is to occur is that people must be freed from having to fight daily battles for simple things, so that they can then become interested in and join bigger ones. Reforms are useful for this purpose, such as the 4-hour day advocated by the IWW, or UBI. No, sorry, go on. Reforms are also necessary to impart, for lack of a better phrase, revolutionary consciousness in a community. Many oppressed groups probably feel a bit irritated and annoyed that radicals spend so much time on certain subjects and so little time on others, like fighting for people of color and the poor in a concrete way. It's one thing to spout off the necessary rhetoric about fighting for the oppressed masses, but it's quite another to join them in the battle for rent controls, an end to police brutality, decent housing, and the establishment of social programs. By fighting with them, one can not only demonstrate that radical philosophies do pertain to issues that concern them, but also can explain how they do so that these reforms do not end as merely reforms, but become stepping stones to bigger and bigger battles. Now, this is not to imply any kind of vanguardist attempt by radicals to come into a community and educate the ignorant population. Notice I said join the battle, not lead the battle. But a presence is necessary to establish contacts with communities and solidify those connections over time. These kinds of attempts at outreach have been ignored for far too long, when they're the real meat and bones of any attempt at a revolutionary movement. Many seem to act under the assumption that a population can go from zero to revolutionary in a day. This does not and will not happen. It especially won't happen if we go on having protests, meetings, groups, and political discussions and expect people to come to us. We have to go to them. We must not force our priorities and pet battles onto them, though we can certainly mention them, but must instead fight for the things that are important and vital to them, even if they are reforms. Our purpose will be to use these battles to show them their own power. Many people do not even believe they can win a fight against their landlord, let alone capitalism, the military, and the entire state machinery of the United States of America. But if they can start winning these smaller skirmishes, then a sense of their own power and ability to effect change will take hold and ferment. However, as mentioned before, there has to be a constant reminder and push to make sure that reforms once gained never satisfy. Reforms can be problematic, and though I've been hard on those who speak out against reformism, I can sympathize with where their viewpoint comes from. Oftentimes, once a movement or group has won a reform, they're content and go back to their regular lives. Back to brunch, as they say. Indeed, governments and institutions grant reforms for this purpose, to pacify. And this is exactly why we have to be part of movements fighting for reforms. To build a revolutionary presence in communities and movements striving towards reforms is the beginning of radicalizing those communities and movements, and placing those reforms in the proper context. There's a wrong-headed notion going around that people are clueless about the ills of society, and we need to just bombard them with enough logic and facts until they see the light. God, just tag me next time, why don't you? Instead of focusing so much time on illustrating the various problems, which many people know about already, we should be focusing on convincing people that an alternative is possible, and that they have the strength to make it a reality. Our presence in reform movements can serve as a bridge or conduit between revolutionary organizations and the people. In addition, reform movements in the right situation can and have been pushed into being revolutionary movements in their own right, and our presence can serve to increase the likelihood of this occurring. While a movement pushing for rent controls, for example, can be said to be promoting false notions as well, namely that we should look to government to protect and provide for us, anarchists in the movement can push for an understanding that sees the movement's goal as the extraction of demands from an enemy until self-sufficiency is attained, not as asking gifts from government. It's important to remember that the process of fighting for reforms is more valuable than the actual reforms themselves. The fight for reforms gives people a sense of their own power to transform society, imparts dignity, and fosters the development of a revolutionary counterculture. Through the battles they fight and their participation in organizations that are structured in empowering ways based on equality, justice, freedom, and cooperation, if anarchists are present in organizations to push for this type of structure, people can get a taste of the future society and thus begin to believe in and deeply desire an alternative. It's important when anarchists participate in reform movements to push for direct action and more militant tactics, when appropriate, of course, so that people power is built and not the power of movement leaders and government or co-opted institutions. So let's make change. We can do it ourselves, we can force the state to make some changes, but in the end we should be working toward the eventual abolition of all oppressive systems and replacing them with self-governance, self-organization, and mutual aid. Thanks.